Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another special video production from the 10th Nazgul. My name is Mitch, and today I'm going to be taking a look at our latest edition of Risk Some Light, an irregularly released series of articles from Fantasy Flight Games wherein they slowly but surely release updates to our LOTR LCG FAQ. We recently saw an update to version 1.6. Admittedly, some of these updates are a little bit dry, so in preparation for tackling our FAQ, I've drank 6 servings of Rockstar energy drink throughout the day today. So, let's get things started by taking a look at the first of 4 new pieces of errata for our player cards. The first of which, and probably the most significant, is a big change to Erebor Battlemaster from the Long Dark Adventure Pack of the Dwarodelf expansion. Originally, this ally read, Erebor Battlemaster gets +1 attack for each other dwarf character you control, but has been significantly nerfed so that now he only receives +1 attack strength for each other dwarf ally you control. So, if a player had been running Dane Ironfoot along with 2 other dwarf heroes, instead of investing 3 resources in a character that hits the table with a minimum of 5 attack strength, all of a sudden this ally is significantly weaker. In the article associated with this update, Caleb and Matt mentioned that this change is meant to ensure the longevity of the game, to make sure that this character doesn't get even more out of control, but they still want it to be respectably powerful. So certainly this isn't going to prevent dwarf decks from trying to hit that 5+ dwarf threshold as quickly as possible. I feel like Erebor Battlemaster is still going to be an at times absurdly hard hitting ally, but that's definitely a huge reduction in strength. I used to run a mono-leadership dwarf deck that took advantage of sphere-fixing effects like Narvi's Belt, specifically so I could put such powerful allies as Erebor Battlemaster into play. For the cost, he just absolutely blew our other Tactics Dwarf allies out of the water. Veteran Axe Hand, a cost of 2 for 3 attack, seems like a really good deal until you compared it to the old version of this ally. And because Erebor Battlemaster was so incredibly powerful, once we moved past Khazad Doom, I don't think I've ever seen anyone run the Veteran of Nanduhirian, so even though nerfs always decrease the power of player decks, I definitely have to take the designer's side where I feel like this is going to be a good investment in the long-term health of the game. I like that we're probably going to be seeing a little bit of a change in some of our top-tier dwarf decks, away from relying so heavily on Erebor Battlemaster. Maybe we'll see some of those other allies resurface, or maybe we'll end up seeing some other damage-enhancing effects take a greater place of prominence, like Khazad or Dwarodelf Axe. So it sucks that this character got nerfed, but all in all, I feel like this is a pretty fair and a pretty good change. Our next card to be errated is Expert Treasure Hunter from The Hobbit on the Doorstep, and it's a very simple change. Instead of reading attached to a hero, it now reads attached to a hero, but limit 1 per hero. So instead of being able to place up to 3 copies of this on 1 questing character, all of a sudden that potentially powerful card advantage effect is a little bit reined in. So it's all in all slightly more difficult for the players to go overboard with card draw. It's not like lore is hurting by any means for card advantage, but again, I feel like this is a pretty fair effect. Our third and fourth pieces of errata both hail from the Blood of Gondor Adventure Pack, the first errata of the Against the Shadows cycle. And the first change is to Quest Phase 1B. It changes the text at the beginning of the combat phase. Each player must turn each of his hidden cards face up or take 1 hidden card, to at the beginning of the combat phase, each player must either turn each of his hidden cards face up or take one hidden card. So they're stressing that at this point the players have a modicum of choice. And our second change is to the location the crossroads. A very minor clarification. Instead of saying the current quest card gains siege, it clarifies that the current quest card gains siege and loses battle. So just a little bit of something to make the text all the more clear for players, which brings us to the first of several rules clarifications, namely 1.44 must X or Y versus must either X or Y. And this is pretty simple. It basically instructs the players that when they're presented with a must do this or that, they need to interpret that as the card instructing them to do the first under any circumstance unless they're absolutely unable to, in which case they have to default to that second option. An example of this is the Pelennor Fields in the massing at Osgiliath, which reads, if the players have crossed the Anduin, Pelennor Fields gains. When faced with the option to travel, the players must X, either travel to Pelennor Fields, or Y, raise each player's threat by 3. So, specifically because the Pelennor Fields uses the term either, this is a good example where the players are actually presented with a choice, as compared to something like the treachery cards that I myself experienced a little bit of confusion with in the Druidan Forest. So when the progression series got up to that point in the Against the Shadow cycle, one of the cards I was slightly puzzled by was Men in the Dark, which reads, when revealed, each hero must pay 1 resource or take 1 damage. And the way that's phrased, at least to me, really sounded like it was presenting the players with a bit of an option. And this rule, of course, clarifies that that is not the case. If they can't pay the resource, they have to take 1 damage. So really, all of these rules clarifications just really drive home the fact that the phrasing of these cards is extremely important. LOTR LCG can certainly be a little ambiguous at times, but from now on, when a card doesn't say choose, when it doesn't say either, we'll know that the intent, at least, is fairly explicit. What's slightly confusing, however, is that some of these rules changes sometimes bring up rules quandaries in and of themselves. Taking a look at the treachery card Counterattack from Assault on Osgiliath, this reads, each player must return the location he controls with the highest threat to the staging area, or raise his threat by the total threat of all locations he controls. So, if you don't control an Osgiliath location to return to the staging area, I don't really understand how you could boost your threat by the number of locations you control. It seems like it would always be 0, so certainly a very oddly phrased card. I'm not sure if at some point that might end up getting an errata itself, or if it was some sort of unintentional oversight. But our next clarification, 1.46, is in regard to the next player, and this is very simple. The rule simply states if there's only 1 player in the game, if it's a solo environment, there is no such thing as the next player, and any card effects that happen to target the next player will not trigger. So in some cases you might end up getting a freebie. The FAQ itself provides the example of Pathless Country, which has a shadow effect. After this attack, the attacking enemy engages the next player, then makes an immediate attack. So, again, in a solo environment, instead of this enemy getting 2 or more attacks that round, it only makes 1, so this becomes an ineffectual shadow effect. Two other examples involving the next player would be the treachery Panicked from the Black Riders, where the first player raises his threat and then passes the first player token to the next player, and the enemy Goblin Sneak from the Long Dark, which reads Forced. After Goblin Sneak engages a player, you discard the top card of the encounter deck, and if it's a treachery card, it engages the next player if able. So instead of cycling faster through the encounter deck, that effect essentially stops as soon as this enemy engages with you. Our next rules clarification is 1.47, and it's all about immunity to player card effects. And out of any FAQ entry, by far does this receive the most text. This is also probably the most controversial entry, as throughout the history of LOTR LCG, there have been a number of different occasions when the developers, although they themselves have turned over and changed over time, have gone a little bit back and forth in regard to their rulings. So at the present moment, this version of the FAQ explicitly states that any card with the text immune to player card effects completely ignores the effects of all player cards, go figure. But they define a term called framework effect, which is any of the normal mechanics of the game, such as placing progress tokens on locations or quest cards, dealing combat damage to an enemy, essentially anything that doesn't target or pick or choose a card directly. This section gives the example that something like Hands Upon the Bow would be illegal to use on an immune to player card effects enemy because the player has to specifically pick the enemy that would be the recipient of that attack, whereas an event like Quick Strike simply allows the character, as in the character is being targeted, not the enemy immune to player card effects, to declare an attack, which the FAQ dubs a normal framework effect. Back in the day when I was making the player card review for our A Journey to Rosgobel adventure pack, I remember emailing the developers about Ancient Matham. Could you stick that on a location like the Karuk? And I believe I directly quoted an email I got in return in that video where they said pretty clearly that that was kosher, it was cool to do that. We no longer can. This now seems abundantly clear to me, so whether the devs went back on a ruling or not, from here on out, at least at the moment, their intent could not be more clear. I think a really good way to illustrate this concept is thinking of something like Dwarodelf Axe. So it gives the attached character +1 attack strength, and then has a response that after that character attacks, the attachment targets the defending enemy and deals 1 damage. So if you were attacking Smog the Terrible, while your Erebor Battlemaster would get +1 attack, you unfortunately would not be able to benefit from that response ability, which just stresses the importance of always knowing your scenario. So if you can count on having to go up against some big immune to player card effects enemy, it might be a much better idea to include something like Dwarven Axe in your deck, where you're ensuring that you're only targeting your own characters. And, just like that, we're at the final section of FAQ 1.6, which is the frequently asked questions, the first of which concerns Hobbit hero Sam Gamgee from the Black Riders. And the question is, if I engage more than one enemy with a higher engagement cost than my threat, will the second part of Sam Gamgee's ability trigger more than once even if I cannot ready him multiple times? And the answer is of course a resounding yes. Even though he's not going to be able to ready multiple times, you're nevertheless able to trigger that response, a very important part of which is gaining that significant stat boost. Our second new question, again, mostly a clarification because these are fairly simple, is if an enemy is put into play directly engaged with me, has that enemy engaged me for the purposes of forced effects or responses that trigger from engaging an enemy? And the answer is again yes. No matter how that enemy engages with you, whether it's through engagement checks, optional engagement, a forced effect, or even through the use of one of your own player cards, engage means engage. So we'll certainly have to play with that in mind. Our third question, which at the very least has been answered in emails before, although we haven't seen this effect pulled off in the progression series, is can I use Dory from Overhill and Underhill to prevent damage from being assigned to the hero Bjorn, even though he himself has that immune to player card effects clause? And the answer is again yes, because Dory targets the damage and not the actual character. You're able to circumvent that entire player card immunity factor. Wrapping up our FAQ, our second to last question is, when playing the Blood of Gondor, if a card effect turns each of my hidden cards face up and one of those cards forces me to take another hidden card, do I have to turn that card face up as well? And the answer is no. Similar to how treachery cards work by changing the state of the staging area in that moment or until the end of the phase, we can picture this effect as causing somewhat of a snapshot in time. So the moment that the ambush, lying in wait, or a number of other effects turns your hidden cards face up, any subsequent hidden cards that you're forced to put into play stay face down, because at the time that that original effect was triggered, they weren't a part of the current game state at that time and therefore remain entirely unaffected. To bring this video to a close, our very final question harkens all the way back to the core set, although this is entirely relevant today, specifically because the Nightmare version of Escape from Dol Guldur is widely considered to either be, or at least is a contender for, the most difficult scenario released to date. The question is, during the setup for Quest Phase 1A, should each objective have one encounter card attached to it or two? And this is confusing because the quest card itself, during the setup portion, specifically instructs the players after shuffling the encounter deck and putting those objectives in play to attach one encounter card to each objective. So, considering that those three objectives themselves have the guarded keyword, the phrasing of that quest card is more than a little ambiguous. But, of course, our FAQ provides the answer. It is that each guarded objective should only have one attached encounter card. The developers back in the core set only intended this attach one encounter to each objective card clause on the quest card to be a bit of a reminder for the players. So if part of the reason why you've been banging your head against the wall so hard trying to overcome the Nightmare version of Escape from Dol Guldur was specifically because you misinterpreted the apparent intent of this game's original developers, maybe you can ease back the difficulty on yourself, resting assured that it's only one encounter card per guarded objective. But with that covered, that brings FAQ 1.6 to a close. To inspire a little bit of discussion, I'll just ask you in the comments. Let me know if there's any rules questions that you have. Something you've either been wondering for ages, or a question regarding our new content, just because in this game these ambiguities crop up all the time, and with the snail pace that this FAQ is updated, even though the developers are pretty good about responding to emails, it can make for a pretty frustrating experience wanting to play this game, wanting to abide by the rules, but not being exactly sure what those are. So, as always, thank you guys very much for checking out this video. Be sure to hit that like button if for nothing else other than sympathy. Like I said at the onset of the video, A lot of it was fairly cut and dry, fairly small, minor edits to existing cards. The rules clarifications were themselves pretty insignificant. Our errata was either fairly sensical or just a minor clarification itself, but rest assured that these FAQ updates only come out every 4 to 6 months or so. They're not always this cut and dry. Sometimes the changes are much more significant, much more interesting, and make for a hell of a lot more discussion. But you've made it through, so thanks for sticking with me. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Check out 10th Nazgul Show on Facebook. Feel free to let me know what you thought of this video, if you found it informative. If you're anything like me, instead of sitting and reading a long, boring FAQ, you'd much rather turn on a video and go do the dishes or walk in the other room and do something, anything else. But as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you again soon.